First, thanks a lot for this new invitation to participate in this platform. So my name is Pierre-Yves Le Meur. I am an anthropologist and I work for IRD, which is the French Institute for Development Research. So French institute, public institute, working in the field of development in a very broad fashion, interdisciplinary especially. And I am specifically an anthropologist, and I have been working for a long time in the Pacific region, in fact, in New Caledonia, where I was based during 8 years. And my main approach or topic is political anthropology with a strong emphasis on the governance of natural resources. And in the Pacific, especially mining, but not only, also the land issue and environmental issues. Once again, thanks for the invitation, because I find this platform very interesting, very stimulating too, because it's a combination of plenary sessions or conference with people coming from different backgrounds, disciplinary backgrounds, and different places also. And there is this combination between plenary session and workshop, and especially the fieldwork workshop I participate in, and what I find very interesting, because we have students coming from all over the regions, from Burma, from Vietnam, from Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and this kind of intercultural exchange on the basis of a common topic, so water management, for instance, is very fruitful for, I think, at once for the trainers, but also for the students, of course. Okay, so my presentation will be about water, which is not a surprise, but I will explain to what extent it is a little bit a surprise. So the title is about water governance and water knowledge. And I think that one of the main ideas I want to put forward is the idea that when people talk about water governance, they talk about governance, they talk about governing infrastructure, for instance, irrigation schemes or these kind of things, water supply, but they don't talk much about water. What is water? There is a tendency to see water as just a sort of resource, economic resource, possibly political or geopolitical resource, but there is no idea about what is water as a substance. It is a sort of abstraction, which is a little bit outside the scope of the debate, all the debates about water governance. So the idea would be, from the anthropological point of view that I want to sustain, the idea would be to reintroduce a debate about water, not only as a resource, but also as a substance. Substance endowed with meaning, with maybe agency, with, for some people in the world, with spirituality and so on. The idea to reintroduce water in the debate about water governance. And it's not only that, but the point after that is to maybe to shift or to change a little bit the terms of the debate about water governance on the basis of the fact that all the people don't see water from the same point of view, with the same representation or with the same knowledge. And I think there is a sort of issue of enriching the debate about water governance by introducing what is water for people, and from different cultural point of view. And I will try also to bring in this debate examples or cases coming from different geographical background. In fact three. One will be about Cambodia, because we are in Cambodia. So, and I didn't mention that before, but I used to work a little bit in Cambodia before working for IRD, so in the 2000s. And there will be another example about New Caledonia, where I work now. And I will also use a case study by a colleague working in South America, in the Andean region, which is very interesting, about mining on glacier. So that's the idea, to bring some examples from different backgrounds and to try to bring a sort of debate about the relationships about governance and knowledge in the field of water, let's say, management. Thank you very much for this presentation, and thanks a lot for the invitation to participate in this summer school. So my talk will be about water, which is not a big surprise. But as we will see, it is not that obvious. So that was the introduction. Maybe just to mention it, so as said, I am an anthropologist, and my research mainly focuses on the politics of natural resources, so meaning land, mining, but also water, salt water, fresh water. So that's why I was interested in doing this conference, because it gave me the opportunity to do a sort of overview of the literature in social sciences around this topic, and to see what are the current questions or issues. So the idea, of course, not a big overview of the literature. I will start with the notion of water governance, and just a simple question, what it is governing water, because it's a very usual expression. And is it about governing water infrastructures, like irrigation schemes, or is it about governing the very complex assemblage of people involved in managing or using or dealing with water infrastructure, water supply, water irrigation schemes, once again? So this question remains open in a way, but what is interesting when you observe all this literature about water governance, it doesn't talk about water. It talks about governance, it talks about infrastructure, but what is water in the end is not really discussed. So that's the idea, to discuss what water is. It's not a stupid question, yes. Don't worry. And maybe to raise this question allows us in the end to come back to the notion of water governance, hopefully. So to start with a very simple facts and figures. So first idea, water is everywhere. It's 70% of the Earth's surface, or 75%, it's 70% of human weight. So you can say water is everywhere. At the same time, fresh water is not that frequent. It's only less than 3% of all the water on Earth. And within that, there is 2/3 of it which is made of ice caps and glacier. So that means that fresh water is not that frequent, and not that accessible. And I would say, step forward, that water in a way is invisible, or it's visible only in certain circumstances. By excess, when there is flood, when there is tsunami, you see water, or by the lack of it, when there is drought, for instance. Or it's also visible where there is a conflict over water. In a way, water is seen as risk, but is not seen as such. So the question would be, what is the nature of water? What is water? And how the conception of water could influence the way of governing it. So this slide is, so to say, a sort of summary of the usual issues around water governance. When I say usual, I don't say it's not relevant. It's of course extremely relevant. First issue, water is unevenly distributed and used, and there are aggravating factors such as climate change and the growing demand on competition around this demand. So you have a situation of unequal access to water, and it's an issue of social justice in a way. You have also more increasing threats to freshwater quality. And what is interesting, I won't go into the details, but you have to distinguish between point source discharges and no point runoffs. The idea is that you have situations where pollution can be identified, but because it is localized on a point which is easy to identify. You have, for instance, I don't know, water treatment plant, and you see that there is a problem at that point. But you have also a situation where the water pollution is difficult to identify because it comes from different sources, not just one source. Anyway, you have an unequal quality of resource, of water. So it's there is an issue about environmental justice, also because the effect or the impact of this pollution are, in general, stronger or deeper on poor populations than on wealthy populations. There is, as already said, a growing competition over water through intensive farming, mining, transboundary disputes, commoditization. So it's a global political economy issue. And you have, of course, this localization of the issue when you have imbalance, localized imbalance between supply and demand, with tension, with conflict. And what is interesting to observe is the fact that the conflicts are not only about water access, but very often also about the arrangements to get access to water. What are the good solutions, for instance? So it's the issue of politics of water. And parallel to all these trends, you have also a sort of emerging or re-emerging, it's not a new idea, view, which is to see water as commons. So it could be seen as a sort of counter-narrative facing the neoliberal globalization. But what is interesting with this idea of water as commons is you have different ways of seeing that. The first one is the usual one, commons as common pool resource, so the idea of institutional arrangement allowing people to manage a common resource or common pool resource. So very much inspired by Elinor Ostrom's work, for instance. But you can also see the idea of commons as a sort of social imaginary, a way of seeing, a way of conceptualizing the idea of sharing water. It does not mean that it will be translated into institutional arrangements, specific ones. It can be translated into privatization or public work, but there is behind that a possible social imaginary of water as commons. And in that way, it's also a sort of political horizon, meaning also political actions around that. When you see, for instance, the anti-privatization movement in Cochabamba in Bolivia in 2001 or 2, I don't remember. Maybe you know this. There was a big struggle around water. It was in Bolivia because of the privatization of water supply and the granting of a license for private license to a multinational company. And it generated a very strong movement among the populations against this idea of privatization of water. And what is interesting is, in the end, it does not result in a common pool resource arrangement, but there was obviously this idea or this imaginary of water as commons, which was a driving force of people reacting against privatization. So back to the initial question, what is water? It's not that easy to answer. So is it a thing? It's a very peculiar one. Is it an element related to other elements, as in medieval or antique philosophy, with the fire, air, earth? Water has become also a sort of chemical abstraction, thanks to Lavoisier in the 18th century. And it has remained so, in a way. But you can also see water as something else, as a sort of composite body made of H2O plus all what lives or moves in. The fact that people, so it's the idea of modern water, this idea of abstraction. Water has become simply a resource, political or economic resource. That is what I call modern water, and I borrow the expression from Jamie Linton, who wrote a very interesting book, which is called What is Water? So it was 300 pages about what is water, so that's interesting. But you can see water differently as a sort of substance. And it's also a meaningful substance, a cultural substance. Of course, it's a material entity, specific one, characterized by fluidity, mobility, generated what Veronica Strang called fluidscapes or waterscapes. And you can also see water as a sort of actor or actor network endowed with agency, spirituality, and more recently, legal personality, like we've seen with the Whanganui River in New Zealand a few years ago. Of course, the idea of seeing water as an actor is a bit strange, giving agency or granting agency to water. But if we follow this proposal by John Wagner, if the actors within a given social system are human, non-human, animate, or non-inanimate, then agency does not have to be defined exclusively in terms of intentionality, because that's the usual way of conceiving agency. Intentionality of human beings, capacity to reflect on their own actions and to learn and to have and to learn of their own actions and to learn of the context to create new forms of action. But you can also define agency in terms of the impact of a given actor within the network. And in that case, we can see that water can be conceived as a sort of agent. Anyway, this idea to give agency to water is a way of making water visible and to try to know what we govern when we say we do water governance. And we will see that of course it's an issue about the relation between power and knowledge, but it's also an issue of competing view of what is water. If you go back to how this idea of modern Western water emerged, there is a very interesting moment in the 30s, and it's not a hazard. No, hazard is a Frenchism, Gallicism. It's not a surprise, because it's typically a US idea at a moment when US government, the United States of America government, tried also to govern more water irrigation schemes and so on in the 30s. Anyway, Horton was a hydraulic engineer, and he was probably the first to do a presentation, to give a representation of what is a hydrological cycle. I don't think it's very easy to read. It's not, obviously, but it's not important. Now, the idea is that within you can check within this cycle you have only natural elements. So the idea is to describe the cycle of water through rain, ground, clouds, and so on. At the same time, it's not only that. You could say, okay, it's a sort of scientific representation of a specific field of inquiry, but in a way, it created this field of inquiry, a separate field of inquiry or separate field of science, hydrological science. It also helped to create a community of technical experts, hydrologists, to legitimize a specific authority over water, a way of governing water through technical lenses. And it was also a way, I borrowed it from no, that's okay. To render water resources legible to state authority. So what we have, it's not only the emergence of a new field for science, you have at the same time the emergence of a new field of science, but a new field of technical expertise and a new domain of policy. So it is sort of situated partial knowledge used for economic and political ends. So it's a matter of state making, basically. So the question would be, where is the society in this kind of model? And what is interesting is that you have had a new way of reintegrating society in the hydrological cycle in the 50s to try to understand what are the relations, for instance, between state making and power over water. So that's a very famous text by Karl Wittfogel, Hydraulic Society in 57. So the idea of articulating water and power, infrastructure, and state making. Of course, there was a sort of strong criticism against this model, the fact that it was extremely determined by a sort of technological bias. And water was not in this picture, and it was also very much focused on the relation between infrastructure and political power, state making, and the relation between society and nature was also a little bit outside the scope of this kind of conceptualization. So it's very brief account. In the let's say in the 20-30 last years, there was a tendency to go out of this view of water as a sort of pure chemical element. First, through the recognition of water entanglements with other ecological processes and with human society. The fact also, which is extremely important in that respect, that water has become, so to say, everybody's business. It's not only state business now. So it's business for civil society, for indigenous people, for critical scholars, and it has had a strong influence on the way of seeing water governance. There is also the fact that with the increasing water pollution, river regulation, the rise of the Anthropocene, so the awareness of the Anthropocene, so the climate change and so on, there is a sort of disappearing natural water. There is no more natural water. So water is not anymore a natural element because natural water has disappeared in a way. And what is interesting is to observe the notions that are used to describe all that. One is the three that are mentioned here are very interesting. One is watershed. Watershed is a sort of physical unit determined by the flows of water. But what is not uninteresting is the fact that it has been used also for trying to invent new way of governing a watershed on the basis of the participation of the different stakeholders involved or inhabiting the place. So watershed is a very interesting hybrid because at the same time it's a physical unit, but it's also, or it has become a sort of political unit for managing a resource which is water. Water regimes, it's a little bit the same. As at the beginning it was a very much hydrological notion, but it has also become a sort of political notion or policy-making notion, meaning that it includes also all the regulation norms governing water. And more recently, we've seen, I think it's not that recent, but it's a sort of re-emergence, the idea of waterscapes. So landscapes, so it's the equivalent of landscapes, modeled or reshaped by water and by water uses and water governance, water management. So all this resulted in the 90s, more or less, in the idea of integrated water management. But what is interesting is that to a certain point, it's a way of integrating society in the view of water and waterscapes. But at the same time, it is based on the idea of a separation between water and society, on nature and society. The idea is that all this has to be integrated. That's why a few scholars proposed more recently the idea of hydrosocial cycle. So it's the idea of reintroducing society in the way of seeing water cycle. So the idea of a social natural process by which water and society make and remake each other over space and time. So it's a very broad definition. But three ideas are very important. The idea is that water management and social organization mutually influence themselves. The idea is that water and society are internally related, And also the fact that it takes also into account the materiality, the very materiality of water. So on the left, you have another representation, more nicer, more beautiful, of the hydrological cycle, but basically it's the same as the one by Orton in 31, but with colors. And here, the idea that you have a sort of entanglement of human and natural processes, hence this idea of socio-natural processes. It's not a matter of integration, it all is internally related. And we can also represent that in a very simple model. And what is interesting in that model is the separation between two meanings of water. One is water as a material, so H2O, so chemical substance, or physical and chemical substance, which is influenced and which is influencing influencing technology infrastructure and social power and social structures. So the idea of a permanent retroaction, feedback, interaction between the three elements of the system. I don't know if it is a system, but as a model, it's not uninteresting to talk about system here. So the idea is that each element of the system are hybrids. And water, in the end, is the integration of all the components of this system. So the idea of water as a context-dependent and changing outcome of the assemblage of water, H2O, technology and society. Now I would like to present you through three short case studies coming from very different geographical backgrounds. One comes from New Caledonia, so in the Pacific Island, not very far away from Australia. The second one will be from the Pacific region, but the other side, so Chile, Argentina. And the third one will be about Cambodia, because we are in Cambodia. And I used to work a little bit in Cambodia a few years ago before to work for IRD. So the first one about New Caledonia, it is about how you could conceive water differently from this idea of modern water, separated from nature, separated from everything, in a way. And this representation is a drawing made by an elder, Kanak elder, so the Kanak people are the indigenous people of New Caledonia. And it is a way of representing how was the landscape and waterscape in the 50s. I won't give you all the details of this representation, but what is very interesting, I put that on the next slide, is the fact that water in this kind of representation is a sort of mirror of society. It represents the social and political hierarchies between clans within a chieftaincy, because you have different clans with different functions. And one of the functions is to master water. So there is a water clan. So there is also a totemic dimension, so the water can be the totem of a clan. The fact also that water is a place for ancestors and represent in that way the strong link between living humans and dead humans, so the ancestors. So that means that water is also included in a way of representing society. It's not a separate entity. And there is also what is very classic in a way, a gender-based opposition between wet and dry. In the, all the places in green, it's taro cropping terraces with irrigation systems, and taro is a sort of female principle opposed to yam cropping, which is male, and so on. So there is all these oppositions that are also present through the positioning of water within the system or within society. So that means that water is a sort of building block of landscape or waterscapes, You have also different waters, meaning different functions of water, healing function, a repository of ancestors, and so on. So the nature of water is extremely heterogeneous in a way. It's not a pure chemical abstraction. And of course, at a certain point, this way of representing water can be also, in a more sort of political level, it's a discursive resource to negotiate with state administration or mining companies. When you say, okay, you want to do that in this place, but it's a very important place for ancestors and so on, and water is part of us, and we are part of water. It's a way also, it doesn't mean that it's completely strategic, people believe that, but at the same time, it's a way of negotiating with other entities. It has been very well described also by people, scholars working on Maori people in New Zealand. So that means what is also interesting, I don't have time to discuss all that, but water is not only a mirror of society, it's also a sort of distorted mirror of society, because this kind of representation made so in the 2010s about the reality of the 1950s, I am almost sure that reality was different from that in the 50s too. It is a sort of pre-colonial idealization or representation of irrigation systems that were ruptured or broken by colonization. So that means that there is also this underlying representation of landscape, waterscape, and water, which is still functioning, although part of it has been destroyed in material terms. But it's not exactly functioning, because at the same time, many knowledges and practices have also disappeared with the disappearing of irrigation systems, for instance. So this idea of representing water and waterscapes conflate also different historical movements. So the second example is quite exotic. It's about glacier, characterizing, measuring, displacing. So the starting point, it is a big mining project run by Barrick Gold, which is one of the biggest multinational companies, mining companies. And the idea was to open a new open pit mine. So at the border of Chile and Argentina, I think it was the first large-scale binational or transnational mining project, or at that scale at least. And the idea was, okay, there are glaciers. It bothers us to do the mining job, so we have to displace the glacier. Very simple idea, but the operationalization is not that easy. And what is interesting is that when you try to understand what are the assumptions behind this idea of displacing glacier, first idea, it's just a technical issue. Just have to displace glacier. Okay. Second point, which is maybe more interesting, is the fact that you treat glaciers as separate from the rest, separate from ecosystem, separate from water cycle, and so on. So that's the first idea. And third idea, there is a sort of assumption about the homogeneity of water. So you can measure equivalence. You remove water from a place and you give more water to the basin on another place. So it's a logic of compensation, which is very strong in the mining business. But it's based on a very strong assumption. All the waters are equivalent, are the same. All is water. Okay, and there was many negotiation about national regulations, environmental impact assessment process, etc. What is also interesting is that there was contestation. I will describe that very quickly. But what was interesting is the fact that against the protest of local people, protest against the idea of displacing glacier, the mining corporation invited scholars to do their job as scholars, scientific job, to prove that in a way these glaciers are not really glaciers. They are just piece of glaze, piece of ice, pardon, sorry, because they have not all the features of a real glacier. I am not competent to enter the details, but what was interesting is that in the end, they could say, okay, we have scientific people, specialists of glacier, and they say it's not glacier, it's a piece of ice. So the situation is different. We can displace it because it's not that important. So that's the involvement of what we could call corporate science in the debate. And in face of confronting that, there was a movement of contesting the equivalence of all waters. So people said, for instance, against this idea of measurability of quantity of water, what is important for nous as local peasants is the fact, or local farmers, the fact that you have seasonal variability, for instance, which is completely different from the idea of a global quantity of water during 1 year. And you have also annual variability, which is even worse. Another idea was that this glacier was not equivalent to another one. It was a unique place. So there was this idea of place-based logic, of attachment to a place, to this glacier. And what is interesting, it was also a site of convergence between local people contesting the mining project and global networks of scientists and NGOs saying the same thing, but on the basis of a slightly different discourse. Discourse of these glaciers are part of the common heritage of mankind, for instance. Also the fact that they are a marker of climate change, and they are, in that respect, very useful. So they brought also in the debate a sort of aesthetic and affective dimension, and all this created a sort of politics of non-equivalence. All the waters are not equivalent, so you cannot remove this glacier. Those glaciers this glacier has become a sort of non-negotiable entity, bridging natural, social wars and multiple interests and groups, so a sort of hybrid assemblage. And in the end, they won for the moment. Last example, Prenu polders, so in the south of Cambodia, near Sihanoukville. So before working for IRD, I was working for a French NGO called GRET, and on the basis of funding from AFD, thank you AFD, French Agency for Development, you heard of it this morning. There was a project of rehabilitation of polders, and these polders were created in the 30s, in fact. What is interesting here is I cannot go deep in the details, but what is interesting is to see the size of the project. So it's written somewhere, 6 polders, it's 11,000 hectares, so it's not a small irrigation schemes, for instance. This polder is very different in terms of water management. You have 43 villages, 7,000 households. So of course, this place, you know all that, was a place where the mother of Marguerite Duras used to live and try to fight against the Pacific, and she lost in the end. So you have a very complex waterscape, which is also made of different historical layers. So the dikes created in the 30s, what is called the canal and dike 75 was done during the Khmer Rouge regime, so with a strong human impact, as you can imagine. So this waterscape is also, of course, a historical or historically built waterscape. And what is interesting here is that you have, in a way, you have many waters that are at stake. Because the project wants to rehabilitate a polder infrastructure, control the freshwater level within the polders, stop saltwater intrusion, so at least you have 2 waters, so you have freshwater and saltwater. And there are different objectives, increasing agricultural production, facilitate transportation, and the idea also of transferring the management of the polders to a water users association, representing all the households having a plot of land and exploiting or farming this area. And all this results in a complex apparatus or assemblage of water plus people plus plants plus infrastructure. So water cannot be separated from that. And I don't know now, because I used to work at that place at the beginning of the 2000s, and the last time I went there it was 2005 or 6. But there was a strong potential competition between this idea of having, put that again, having the whole polder, so all this area managed by this water users association, and a competition between this idea and a trend toward decentralization, because there was a decentralization law, I think it was in 2002. And in that case, the management of the polders could have been delegated to the communes. And the communes are a lower level in terms of size than all these polders. So it could have been, as a result, the dismantling of the polders, at least the dismantling of the water users association. So that's the first point. And the other point is the fact that you have other users that are not included in this water users association. You have the park, there is a natural park, which is a little bit overlapping on one of the polders. And you have also shrimp farmers who want to use another water, which is salt water, in the mangrove, with a risk for all the infrastructure. So I don't know the end result, but the fact is that you have different assemblage, including different uses of water that are at stake and competing in the same area. That's another way of bringing water back in the landscape. But I can't say anything about local representation, knowledge about water, as I said, for instance, for the New Caledonian case. It could be interesting to investigate that. And it's also interesting, just get the idea now, but interesting to see that during this project we did many studies and so on, with a strong social science component, but forgetting maybe the fact that people have a sort of different knowledge and representation of water, which was not at all taken into account in all these studies. Could be interesting to see what it can be. Anyway, if we try to summarize all this in a very simplified representation, we could say that on the right side, you have the idea of modern water. It's homogeneous, sort of chemical substance. So it is sort of essential definition. It's a thing with a chemical and physical characterization. Biology is seen as a sort of externality. So when you talk about environmental and health issues around water, it's a way of saying there are things that should not be there and that are in water. So there is the idea of separation. And you have also behind that the possibility to see water as a sort of abstraction, which is subject to quantification, subject to a sort of universal measure, so subject to equivalence, as we've seen for the mining case in Chile and Argentina. And that also allows to see water as a commodity, because you can extract it from its environment. On the other hand, you have the possibility to see water from a different perspective. It's not pre-modern. It is pre-modern in the Western sense, because in Europe in the 16th century, water was not homogeneous, water was not a commodity, and water was not seen as a sort of chemical abstraction. But you can have still this kind of a representation of water as heterogeneous. You have, in that case, sort of relational definition of water. Water is only understandable when integrated in its environment. So it's also a sort of holistic representation. And you don't have any possibility of quantification of universal equivalence between different sorts of water. Or if you want to do equivalence, you have to negotiate. There is no price. So the idea is that you have a sort of place-based qualification of water, and it can be, in that respect, a sort of common good. So to finish, so as said before, sort of summary of all the argument. The modern water was based on the water society separation with the idea of hydrological cycle, and even if you see how integrated water resource management works, it's also based to a certain extent on this kind of separation. So all this favors specific forms of expertise and policy. And what is interesting with this idea of hydrosocial cycle approach is that you have stronger integration of water society and technology as all being hybrid entities. And all this contribute to make water more visible, the idea of water agencies, the idea of seeing water as a meaningful substance. And what is interesting is not only the fact that you see water, because you can see water if you want to see it. What is interesting is you can see also people having or mobilizing this kind of representations or knowledge about water. So it's a way also of integrated different viewpoints about water in the negotiation, let's say, around water management, water governance. So that means that to claim or to advocate for participation, it's not enough if you don't take into account the fact that people can have a completely different representation of the object at stake. And what is interesting is you have a recent development of, which is not only recognizing agency to water, but to grant it legal personality, as we've seen in the case of the Wanganui River in New Zealand. So it's a very recent case. I know that people are trying to do the same with the Pacific Ocean, which is a sort of bigger issue. But the idea to grant legal personality to a non-human entity is not uninteresting. And what is maybe to consider here is the fact that it's not water as such which is granted personality, it's a water, so a river in that case. So once again, an assemblage of different things, different entities, human and non-human, integrated in a common history in a way. Okay, so I think that was it. So in the end, you have this idea of having multiple alternative water knowledge or ways of knowing water. That means that you have also possibly different epistemologies about water. And this could be a good argument or good opportunity, this recognition, opportunity to reappraise water government and water politics between this idea of common and control policy or naive variation around participation. And I think that this perspective of water as commons is interesting if you consider the different meaning of commons, so institutional arrangements, political action, and social imaginary. Thank you.